Today I want to talk about code reviews. More specifically, I will explain what code reviews are, why they are important, what you can expect from them when you inevitably get your code reviewed, and lastly, what you can expect when you review other people's code. This is the second video in the series on applied software engineering, but the first one that talks about the proverbial tools of the trade and processes that are widely used across the industry. Additionally, this video is intended for an audience that is interested in finding out more about what the job of a software engineer actually looks like, but has little experience in the industry. Alright, I don't have much more to add in the introduction, so let's begin. Let's start with the basics. What even are code reviews? Code reviews are simply a business process that attempt to ensure the quality of software by having other software engineers look over the code that is about to be submitted and check for issues and errors. This is a very dry, yet accurate description, but let's break it down a little further and provide some context. First things first, code review is a business process. This is actually an important distinction. You could theoretically add code to a code base without a code review, but that is quite frowned upon within a professional organization. Second point that needs attention. Code review only attempts to ensure the quality of software. It does not completely prevent software quality issues. This is because in a complex enough codebase, some interactions will not be possible to account for within a finite amount of time, and it's still a human that does the review, so errors may creep in regardless of effort. Last point is that code reviews are done by other software engineers, and not the author of the code. I mean, this should be obvious. If you have submitted the code for review, you clearly already missed the issues you introduced. The whole point is to spread the load of checking for issues across many engineers with different contexts for potential issues. Code review is a practice that is so common across the industry that there are many tools that facilitate them. GitHub has its own code review platform, so does GitLab, so does Jarrett, and there are even standalone code review platforms not associated with any version control repository system such as ReviewBoard. An interesting thing about code reviews is that it's not just a tool to maintain code quality, it has some other neat side effects to it. It's a way to transfer information and context between developers. This is a huge benefit that might be overlooked by new devs and students. Typically, a code review platform will notify the maintainers of that part of the code that it needs to be reviewed. This means that if someone external to the team makes changes, the rest of the team will still know about the changes currently being made to the package they own, and not just the people that are explicitly tagged in a review. Also, when the review is done, all issues are resolved, and the pull request merges, that terminology will be discussed in a future video, the review with all the resolved comments, discussions, and intermediate changes will remain and can be looked at for context at a later date when that code is under the looking glass of a bug scrub. Here's an example of the review history sticking around based on my experience. The code base for the compiler project I worked on with 3 other people has 134 pull requests, all of which were reviewed by someone other than the author. Additionally, I can go back and see the discussion that we had, which is rather convenient. So, now that you know what code reviews are and why they are somewhat important, let me give you an example of the typical workflow for a code review. At first, the code author writes the code and creates the review request. Then the reviewers will potentially add some comments that they want to be addressed in the code. At this point, the author will either discuss that comment with the reviewer or make the changes requested. This loop of adding code and reviewing it will keep going until the reviewers are satisfied with the change list, and then it will be given an LGTM or ship it, and the review will get merged. Quickly on the topic of the LGTM acronym, some people, for some reason, do not agree on the meaning of it. The typical accepted meanings are looks good to me and let's get this merged. I've personally seen let's get this money, and I have heard someone say let's gargle these marbles as a joke once. It kinda doesn't matter, but is always a good topic to debate on the 16th hour of a hackathon when you're extremely sleep deprived. Anyway, I feel like I'm rambling at this point, so let me give some advice from both the perspective of a new developer submitting their code for review and from the perspective of a new developer doing code reviews. Since a new developer is likely to be on the receiving end of a code review first, I will talk about that first and then follow up with advice for doing code reviews. The absolute first thing that needs to be said, at least in my opinion anyway, is that comments and issues with your code are not issues with you as a person, so don't take them personally. This seems to be a rather common problem across the industry, especially for newer developers. The reason this is an issue for newer devs is because your first reviews will have a lot of feedback on them, most of the issues being extremely nitpicky. The problem is that while as a new hire you are not likely to work in complex or complicated code, you are still not familiar with code style and format requirements, or the typical patterns that the code base should follow. Therefore, newer software engineers and interns tend to get very intimidated by the amount of feedback and take it personally. After all, who cares if that one line of code is over 85 characters long, right? Well, wrong. If the code formatting guideline says it should be 85 characters and under, keep it that way. Code uniformity is important for reading it back later. There are two ways that people take code review personally. They either get defensive and combative with the reviewers, or start dreading code reviews and lose all their confidence. Let's talk about the latter case first. As just mentioned, the next piece of advice I have is to not be afraid of code review. Code reviews are friends, not foes. As already mentioned, there are a lot of benefits to code reviews from the perspective of the team when it comes to code quality, but there are a lot of benefits for the developer as well. When code is reviewed by someone with way more experience, they may suggest better ways to approach a problem than you ever knew about before. As an example, I learned about being able to compare large sets of elements together in C++ using a stud tie through code review feedback, and that's a cool tool that is now in my toolbox. The next piece of advice I have is that you should not be afraid to push back, but you should still be polite. Sometimes, during a code review, comments will be left that are clearly wrong, most of the time because the person reviewing your code is missing the whole picture that you might have. If your first thought that comes to mind is, "What an idiot, can't even see what I'm talking about," take a step back and remember the first piece of advice I gave. Do not take this personally. However, if your first thought is, "Oh man, they probably know something I don't, I won't question it and fix it the way they suggested. After all, I know next to nothing," then also take a second and take a step back. In the case that someone left feedback that is clearly just missing a bit of context, you need to push back. Let me give a quick example here from my work. I got feedback from a well-respected senior dev saying, "Hey, this does not seem right. You are adding unnecessary complexity. Just do XYZ, and this will be far cleaner." However, I couldn't do XYZ, and needed all the extra complexity to be able to handle a really annoying edge case. Therefore, I had to push back, but do so in a polite way. The way I pushed back is as follows. I disagree. This complexity is warranted by case A. If we do not do the following, we will have no way to correctly handle this case in a component further downstream, as it has a simple queue as the backlog. However, I see that this needs a comment. Thanks for pointing this out. This is a polite way that documents the assumptions in the review, provides context for the full issue, and now becomes part of the discussion that will forever stay in the code review. In other words, be diplomatic, but also be ready to admit to errors and fix issues if you are not right, even after pushing back. The last piece of advice I have is to pay attention to common issues that keep being brought up during code reviews and fix them yourself ahead of time going forward. As an example, if you often get the feedback of, "Can you add some tests?" or "Can you measure memory impact of this change?" or "Add more comments to that part of the code," then listen to that. After getting such feedback of errors that you are prone to, make a pre-flight checklist of sorts before submitting code for review. In the above example, do not submit a code review if you do not have tests, or if you have large chunks of complicated business logic without comments, or you're modifying core types without checking for the memory impact of that decision. Either way, that is the advice I have for you when it comes to getting your code reviewed. But you will eventually review code as well as a software engineer, so I have some advice for you on that front as well. You will typically start doing code reviews a couple months into your job, when you likely do not know all the tricks that can be done with the language or the framework that you're using. Therefore, do not just hyperfocus on trying to find issues with the code. Pay attention to the cool tricks of the language that you can learn while reviewing the code. That is how I was first introduced to Python generators by a coworker. I was reviewing some tests that they submitted and noticed a really cool piece of infrastructure and learned how they work. More senior developers will use very efficient features of the language that are easier to learn in the limited context of a code review and not by reading the codebase in general with little direction. After all, in a code review, you can see the full context of when the trick was employed when solving a single problem within the code. However, when talking about tricks, some of them seem incredibly arcane at first. While the code may be efficient and elegant from the one perspective, it might look like incomprehensibly complex gobbledygook to you. In this case, do not be afraid to point out this complicated piece of code and ask how it works. Such complexity without documentation that makes it clear what the code is actually doing is a big problem, and will most probably necessitate a comment explaining what it is doing and why. This is a valid issue to raise in a review, and the code author will typically be happy to explain how something works to someone new, even if it's a well-known pattern deployed across the codebase. The next piece of advice I have is to not delay starting to review other people's code for too long. The reason I'm saying this is because no matter when you start, it will be an uncomfortable process at the beginning. After all, reading code is significantly harder than writing it, and this is a skill that will take time to develop properly anyway. Let me share a quick secret with you. All software quality is ensured on a best effort basis, code reviews included. This is because if you try to make sure that every line of code is perfect and without bugs, then you will never deliver anything. Therefore, do not be afraid to do code reviews just because you might miss something. That's why code reviews typically involve multiple people. Similarly, do not be afraid to give code a ship it or an LGTM for similar reasons. I mean, keep it within reason. Don't go around giving an LGTM to code in a part of the code base you have never looked at before, but you get it. The last piece of advice I have for you is to not be afraid to set up a quick call or a meeting to ask for more context from the author. This is actually a really good way to understand a part of the code base that you are working on when someone implements some complex feature. After all, you do not have all the context that the person that wrote the code may have, and trying to learn it all from just reading the code is not feasible at a certain point. This is when it becomes a great idea to just hop in a meeting room with the person and pick their brain for why they wrote the code the way they did. I actually learned of this from a senior engineer that we're currently bringing up to speed. He pulled me into a room and basically asked me, Arseny, there seems to be a lot of undocumented assumptions your code makes because of the existing infrastructure that I don't know about. Explain to me what you're trying to solve and how you're doing it in code. That was an incredibly useful meeting where we ended up discussing a lot of rather convoluted edge cases that showed where I had a lot of undocumented complexity in code. But the meeting was useful for the new senior engineer too, as he was able to learn more about how the different systems that he is working with interact. Anyway, that's about all I got for you in terms of advice, so let's wrap up the video. Alright, in this video you have gotten a high-level understanding of what code reviews are and why they are done. In addition to that, I gave you some advice that should be useful as you start getting your code reviewed in a professional setting and as you start reviewing code as well. While a lot of the information I have tried sharing with you here may seem a bit too abstract if you are very new and have never worked in industry, it should still serve as good context for what the tools of the software engineering trade are, and a decent reference for when you just begin using code reviews as a tool in your work as well. Either way, I really hope that this video was helpful and interesting for you. Feel free to check out this playlist here to watch all the videos I have on the topic of applied software engineering, especially if you're watching this in the future when I have already uploaded the whole series. Also, feel free to ask questions if you have any. I try to respond to all the comments I get, and I have made a few videos based on viewer requests so far. Anyway, thank you for your time. Bye.